How do you become a master at this game? It's estimated that 15% of the salespeople in America sell 65% of everything that is bought. That means 85% of the salespeople are scrambling around for about 35% of the business. Metropolitan Life Insurance, or Columbia University, did a study of metropolitan life insurance agents and found that the top 4% of life insurance agents made 58 times as much money as the bottom 20%. They found that the top 20% of life insurance agents made 16 times as much money as the bottom 80%. It's the old Pareto principle, multiplied, enhanced. The top 20%, basically do about 80% of the business. So as a sales professional, you will either be in the 20% or you'll be in the 80%. If you're not in the 20%, you definitely want to be in the 20%. It is my belief that as we go forward in this economy, there will be less salespeople in all professions. In all industries, it is my belief that there will be less salespeople. I am teaching my clients to hire fewer salespeople, but spend their time finding the top producers or people who have the potential to become top producers and then investing money in them to train them to become top producers, as opposed to having a whole bunch of mediocre people on the street. And in every profession, we're seeing jobs eliminated. We will continue to see jobs eliminated. If Robert Kiyosaki, who wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad, if Harry Dent is right, if Robert Kiyosaki is right, we have an awful lot yet to go in terms of the misery index. And we well may see not only a double dip, but we may well see things worse than we've seen in our lifetime that will make 2008 look like a picnic. Now, I'm not a doom and gloom guy, but I don't believe in being Pollyanna either. I believe in being real. So I personally believe there'll be two kinds of salespeople. Those who are really, really good and making a lot of money, and those who are on the way out of the business. I don't think there's going to be room for anything in between. People are really going to be good, or they will be slowly on their way out of business. So you really have a decision to make. Do you really, really want to be good, or do you just want to kind of hang around? Because the fact of the matter is, if you just hang around, then it's not going to take very much for somebody to come in and kick your ass. I mean, if you're just mediocre, it doesn't take much for somebody to come in and dominate. So, there are 5 levels of becoming a master at selling. The first one is what I call the unconscious incompetent. These are the people who don't know, and they don't know that they don't know. The unwashed masses who don't have a freaking clue about what's going on. The unwashed masses of salespeople who don't have a clue about any of the stuff we talked about today. Not only do they not know how to use an agenda, they never heard of it or don't know you're supposed to use one. So they blindly go through their day doing stupid stuff. And they don't know. They're clueless. They've not seen the light. They have no idea. Usually, the unconscious competent is unconsciously competent because they've never received any kind of training. The conscious competent is actually the second stage, and it usually occurs after you've had some training, after a few weeks of training, in which you are still incompetent. Now you just know it. You're aware of it. It would be like the analogy of playing golf. If you never held a golf club in your hand, and you picked up a golf club to go play golf, you would realize before you started to playing the game, you wouldn't realize how difficult it was or how lousy you were at the game. But it wouldn't take you very long to grab a golf club and go out there and start whacking the ball to realize you suck at golf. I mean, like a Hoover, big time. Same thing with selling, when people start attending training classes. The third stage is where people do become somewhat competent. They're having to think about what they're doing. They are experiencing some success. They are developing some competencies, but they find themselves in this situation where they are on a sales call, but they have to think real hard about what they should be doing next. So it's a conscious thing they have to constantly be thinking about. That usually occurs within 30 to 90 days of training. People start to become consciously competent and exhibiting some positive successes and skill enhancement during that initial period of time. Fourth stage is where somebody becomes unconsciously competent. These are people who go out and do things unconsciously out of habit. They don't have to think about it. You throw them a scenario, they know how to handle it. They don't think twice about it. It's part of their DNA. You can wake them up at 3 o'clock in the morning and throw a role play scenario at them and they handle it beautifully, and they're probably not even awake. You know, they just do it out of rote. It's sort of like Peyton Manning throwing a football. Peyton Manning doesn't have to think. I mean, it's an instant recognition of the defense, and he knows exactly what to do because he's watched so much film and he's practiced so much. It's an unconscious habit. He's practiced it since he was about 8 years old. That usually requires about 750 hours of practice. Same thing could be said for flying jet planes. Look at how many hours in the cockpit most Blue Angels pilots have. It's usually over 2,000 hours and over 100 carrier landings. You know why? They don't need any rookies in the Blue Angels having to think about what they're doing. Everything's got to be unconscious. They've got to be unconscious about what they're doing to the point where there's no mental thought process about what's taking place. And the fifth stage is the... What? The fifth stage, the Jedi Master. Takes years or decades to become a Jedi Master. Now, I've been doing this 30 years. I've been teaching it for 16 years. And the way that you know you're a Jedi Master is you start coming up with things no one else has ever come up with. And you start putting different spins and different applications on things to be able to do. But that's only after you've been at it for usually decades. Dan Kennedy says that if you want to learn how to write effective sales copy, that you should take the 100 best sales letters that have ever been written and write each one of them in longhand 100 times. And he said you will become an unconscious competent, or what he calls, you will be in the flow of copywriting. It will just be part of, inbred, ingrained in you, because there's a flow after you have done it so many times. He also says, I know no other human being on the face of the planet who has done that besides myself. Okay? Same thing can be said about any skill. Why is it that becoming a master takes years of practice? I'm going to give you the neurophysiology of why it takes so much practice so that you can understand, unless you will really understand why after 13 years of kind of a hiatus from this training, you'll understand why there's a regression back to the mean. So there are 3 levels of memory. If you want to really drill down on this, you can study Essentials of Human Memory by Alan Baddeley, B-A-D-D-L-E-Y. Or you can take my word for it. The neuroscientists talk about memory in the terms of three different terms, and I'm going to use the neurological, the neuroscientific nomenclature for this. First one is called working memory. The second one is declarative memory, and the third one is procedural memory. So we'll take each one of those and break them down for a minute. I'm giving you this information not to make you an expert in neurophysiology, but to give you an understanding of why it is you do what you do. Because 95% of everything you do in life is unconscious. There are too many things you have to think about every day, during the course of a day to have to think about everything. If you had to think about everything to do, you'd never get anything done. Working memory is short-term and electrical. Very short-term. Think of working memory as the RAM on a computer. It's the stuff you can pull up basically on your desktop and work the applications that are loaded on your machine, that are open on your machine at any time. You know what happens with a computer when you open too many applications on the computer at the same time. When you overload RAM on a computer, it shuts down or it jams up. The brain is no different. By the same token, when you shut the computer down and turn it off, what happens to the memory stored in the RAM? It all goes away, unless you save it to the hard drive. It goes away. The working memory in a human being is our imagination and conscious awareness, our conscious thought process, which is only about 5% of our experience during a day. So working memory and the three functions it contains slowly disappear as sleep overtakes the mind and the biological computer is shut down. RAM is now gone and anything not saved to the hard drive is lost. Sleep is the great eraser of the mind. Intentionally so. Because if your brain was clogged up with everything you experienced during a day and you carried that with you when you went to sleep, you would be absolutely overwhelmed. So sleep has a function of erasing everything you experienced during the day so you wake up the next day with a fresh mind. Because you can't keep all this stuff in your head constantly in conscious awareness. Declarative memory is an intermediate level of memory. Think of it as an unreliable hard drive. Stuff's sort of there, but you can't count on it to be there. Sometimes you can recall it, sometimes you can't. Like, I know I should know that, and I sort of know the first three digits of the phone number, but for the life of me, I can't remember the rest of it. In the declarative memory, information is slowly erased also by sleep. Over time, we lose the ability to recall that information. We know it as forgetting. Something happened 3 weeks ago, you can't remember it. You know you should, but you can't. Procedural memory is the third and deepest level of memory. It's often been referred to as tacit knowledge or implicit knowledge. It is long-term and chemical. It's involuntary and automatic. Now keep in mind all of these things are a result of chemical actions and processes that occur within the brain. Chemical and electrical things that happen in the brain. Procedural memory, which is long-term memory, like learning your multiplication table, like learning to ride a bicycle, like learning to sell, like learning how to deal with questions and scenarios that people bring up, like fly fishing, like flying a jet plane, anything, like hitting a golf ball. All of that is procedural memory, and the way it becomes long-term memory is through salience and repetition. Salience meaning how important it is for you to remember that, how to do that, and repetition meaning how many times you practice it. So procedural memory really is broken into three different groups. The first one is what's called conditioned reflex. Like stomping on the brake when your car is about to collide with something. You ever had a wreck and you saw it coming and you hit the brake? That was not a thought out response. That wasn't something you thought, well, I am moving at 60 miles an hour and I am going at so many feet per second, and if I hit the brake, it should take me X.6 seconds to stop. No, you just did it like that. You know why? Because you've hit the brake so many times, you've almost been in so many wrecks, it's automatic. Okay? Skills and habits. Playing the piano, swinging a golf club, learning new sales skills, all part of procedural memory. And emotional association, this is where branding, where advertising all comes in, which is the implantation of associative memory with a recall cue. Winston tastes good like a, okay, that's a recall cue. That's a part of associative memory. There's implantation of a recall cue that gets you to associate that with the brand. And you will carry that jingle to your grave, those of you who remember it. It is impossible for you to forget that. You cannot erase that. There is no delete button in your brain that's going to erase that. You know, R.J. Reynolds, or I guess it was R.J. Reynolds, whoever the company was that Winston was a cigarette for, they own they own that mind share. They own that space in your brain. Brainwashing works the same way. Information of extremely high salience or importance may enter into the procedural memory with a repetition factor of 1. Let me give you a great example. How many times as a kid do you have to learn how to touch or not to touch a hot stove?
Once.
Right. Hopefully, right? There are many things that you've learned that are with you permanently that you only had to learn it once. You only had to have a repetition one time. Unfortunately, most things you have to have many repetitions of. In other words, information that is less interesting must be repeated more often to be remembered. No surprise there, right? Neurologically, learning new sales skills is nothing more than the result of salience times repetition, creating new neural pathways in the brain that are electrical and chemical in nature, where you literally cement synapses together where there are new neural pathways in the brain. They're called muscles of the mind, literally. But repetition costs money, it takes time, and it requires a huge commitment. That's why very few people ever get or become masters at selling. They either are unwilling to invest the money, they're looking for a quick fix, don't want to put the time in, or they really like the commitment to get that good. In terms of procedural memory, you talk about conditioned response. That's an automatic response where you don't have to think about it. Now, do you know who won the Nobel Prize in 1904 because of that?
Somebody's dog?
Yeah. A conditioned response is ring the bell, the dog salivates. Okay? And I'll tell you something else. You're no different than a dog. That telephone rings, and by God, you got to jump up and stop everything you're doing, get off the crapper, and go answer the phone. You have conditioned that you got to go answer that phone for some reason, and it's a wrong number, or it's a telemarketer, fraternal order of police, whatever. You know, they're calling, and you have been conditioned that when the phone rings, you got to go answer it. And there are a whole bunch of other things like that we do that are conditioned responses that other people have basically trained us to respond that way. So there are 3 keys to creating a conditioned response. In a selling situation, what happens to a conditioned response is somebody says something to you or throws you something or gives you an objection, and you have heard that so many times that you have an automatic conditioned response to it. Somebody says to me, I'm getting 3 proposals. My response is, and which one am I? I do not have to think about that. Now, depending upon whether it's number 1 or number 3, I've got a response for it. It's been practiced many times, so I don't have to go back and think, oh, now what am I supposed to say? It's like, I'm okay, I'm number 3. So let me ask you this. Usually when people tell me I'm number 3, it's because they want a proposal and a quote from me to justify a buying decision they've already made with someone else. That is my stock response every single time. And I've done it hundreds of times in practice so that I look forward to somebody saying that because I got an answer for everything. There is nothing they can say to me that I don't have an answer for because I've practiced my lines more than they've practiced their lines. I've practiced overcoming objections more than they've given objections. So there are 3 keys to doing that. The first one is consistency. Pavlov never offered food without ringing the bell, and he never rang the bell without offering food. So if you're going to learn a new conditioned response that goes into long-term memory, then there has to be a consistent response to whatever it is that somebody says or does or whatever the scenario is. The second one is frequency. Pavlov trained the dog day after day after day. Now, if you think you can sit through a day-long sales training class and take everything you learned here today and take it out and practice it next week, you need to be in another business. Because you're not going to be able to do 10% of what you left here today with. I don't care how good you are, the first repetition, it's not going to happen. And in fact, 30 days from now, you will have forgotten 95% of what you heard today. Not because I'm not a good facilitator, teacher, instructor, not because you're a bad student. It's just because that's how the mind works. Because unless it's reinforced and used again, there's no reason for the brain to remember any of it. Okay? And the third key is anchoring. Anchoring has to do with the frequency and consistency of creating mind stamping by remembering this thing because it's tied to an emotional anchor. Okay, now here's what that means. It means you got to have a reason. You got to have an emotional reason to want to get good at selling. You got to be hungry. If you're not hungry, and if you're not obsessed to get good at selling, then you're never going to do all this other stuff to get good at selling. And for me, it's being driven to have absolute total control over my life. And the only way I can have absolute total control over my life is where no decision in my life is based on money. And when I have enough in the bank, I can tell people to piss off and not care. And I can do anything I want, come and go anywhere I want, live anywhere I want. And when the weather's not to my liking, I can pack up and go somewhere else. And I don't ever have to worry about that. Or I can meet with someone and I don't have to worry about what the response is going to be. So that's an obsession to get to that point where I have total control over my own destiny and what I want to do. And I don't have to ask anybody's permission or care what anybody thinks about anything I do. Okay? So you got to have a reason. You got to figure out a reason for doing it. The more powerful the reason, the more powerful the anchor, the greater the likelihood of it becoming a reality. So how do you become an unconscious and competent? Okay? This is the bare minimum